Earlier this year, the State Department, remember, Joe Biden's State Department has effectively announced that they will continue to turn their backs on the people of the Marshall Islands, who many decades later are still dealing with the long-term effects of the US conducting nuclear tests on their soil. So we're gonna catch you up on the history of this and talk about what could potentially be done in the future. But first, we're gonna give you a little bit of context and a little bit of history. So we're gonna show you a map, and on this map, you're gonna see a little red dot there. That's the Marshall Islands. You'll notice very far from the United States, which is important in a couple of ways in this story. Probably explains why the US decided to do what they did there of all places. In any event, the US originally took the Marshall Islands from its previous occupiers, the Japanese, way back in 1944. Almost immediately, because the US wanted a place to test nuclear weapons, they evacuated the population, and then, over the course of a little bit more than the next decade, detonated 67 nuclear weapons there, which is just amazing when you think about it. Like, we know that tests were done, but dozens and dozens of explosions over a very small area of land were conducted. One of them, by the way, was called Castle Bravo, the largest artificial detonation, the largest nuclear test of this sort that the US ever conducted. For scale, it was 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So first of all, Waz, that is, I don't even know what that is. 1,000, that's the worst thing that's ever been done in war. And this is 500 times worse than both of them combined. So the idea that we were doing that is just madness, first of all. Any thoughts about that?
I can't say that I'm at all surprised, especially when you think of that period in time when it comes to US foreign policy, where it's just like we kind of get to do what we want to do indiscriminately. I'm not at all shocked by that.
Yeah, well, I want to give.
Not much has changed, by the way.
Yeah, thankfully not as much of that specifically, but I mean, we're dropping conventional weapons in absolutely massive quantities up until today. So this was a description at the time of that particular test. There was a huge, brilliant light that consumed the sky. We all ran outside of our homes to see it. Soon after, we heard a big, loud noise, just like thunder, and the earth started to move. Toward the evening, our skin began to burn like we'd been out in the hot sun all day. The next day, the problems got worse. Big burns began spreading all over our legs, arms, feet, and they hurt very much. Many of us lost our hair. So that's the immediate response to one of these tests. Well, long term, it has had an effect. All of the tests in total have. Those living on the Marshall Islands still suffer disproportionately high rates of cancer, thyroid disorders, stillbirth, including what are nicknamed jellyfish babies because they're born without bones, and congenital birth defects of a number of different sorts as a result of these tests. And by the way, eventually, after all of the testing was concluded, the US did a little bit to clean up the situation. So they cleaned up contaminated soil on the Bikini Atoll, where the United States not only did a lot of these weapons tests, but also conducted a dozen biological weapons tests and took 130 tons of soil that had been irradiated in Nevada and transported it all the way over to the Marshall Islands to be dumped there. They then basically locked it under this dome, sort of a massive concrete coffin called the Runit Dome. That holds more than 3.1 million cubic feet, or enough radiated soil and debris to fill 35 Olympic-sized swimming pools, as well as large amounts of plutonium as well. And maybe at that time, locking this in like a big concrete bubble seemed like enough, maybe, but it's been a long time and it is no longer working. It is already leaking into the ocean, causing the bleaching of coral, killing fish, causing massive algae blooms. And that's just right now. But you might recall that we live in a world where not only we do these large-scale nuclear tests, but we also don't give a damn about the fact that we're ruining our climate. And as a result, one of the consequences is that oceans are rising. And eventually, they will swamp this dome, and we can only imagine what's gonna happen as a result of that. Tides are creeping up its sides, the actual sides of this dome advancing higher every year as glaciers melt and ocean's waters rise. And so the fear is that the leaks are bad enough, but if eventually the entire thing is inundated by the raising sea levels, that God only knows what could happen worldwide if all of this massive amount of irradiated soil and debris is just free flowing into the ocean, Waz.
Yeah, that the damage is basically incalculable. And obviously there's the damage that's been done right now to these people's lives and the environment around them, which they depended on, right, to support themselves and sustain themselves. Obviously, there's that obvious damage, the psychological damage. You can't put a price on some of this stuff, but as far as restitution, I really truly believe that America would not pay restitution to these folks because they know that there would just be an endless line of people and countries and places of being like, yeah, hold on. US did some extremely harmful and ruinous things where we live as well. Where's our restitution? Which is why I don't think they'll ever make these people whole again.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great point. Like if you're living in one of the parts of the world where mines that we dropped during various conflicts are still there and still kill people, or if you're one of the people being affected by discarded, depleted uranium that we've used, or if you've been at the receiving end of not only weapons that we directly produce and then drop, but the massive amount of weapons that we sell to other countries that then use these things. Yeah, I can see that getting pretty huge. So they do want to avoid that. In this case, we are supposed to legally provide for monitoring and some sort of ameliorative sort of response in the areas where we conducted these tests. That's supposed to be the case. But as I alluded to in the intro, the State Department is weaseling out of this in a number of different ways. Now, thankfully, there are some representatives that are watching this. So Representative Porter and Grijalva have been looking into this and trying to pressure the State Department to do the right thing. So they point out that the State Department claimed that because certain monitoring programs have lapsed, the US no longer bears any responsibility for that dome, its maintenance and all of that. The State Department refuses to consult with the Republic of the Marshall Islands on extension of these lapsed monitoring programs as required by our bilateral agreements and US law. And maybe this is something that like we would just take as one weird bit of news under Trump, not surprising in any way. But this is Joe Biden. He's supposed to be the great unifier that's gonna like heal the world's soul and all that. These are people that were incredibly mistreated. He didn't do it, but he is in charge of the country that did. And so he should feel the pressure, not just from people like Representatives Porter and Grijalva, but all of us. We can and should do something about this. It's gonna cost billions of dollars to fix and potentially move the material to make sure that that dome doesn't utterly fail. That is an impossible amount of money for the Marshall Islands to be able to afford in the short term on the scale that we're talking about. For the US though, he just requested his new defense budget. It's a tiny little fraction of that. And it actually would make us safer. This is not some pure hypothetical about how to ward off a Chinese invasion of California. The oceans are going to swamp that dome. It's only a question of when. So this could actually be a real defense portion of our defense budget, Waz. But we'll have to see if they actually feel the pressure and do something about it.
You mentioned unification, and I'll say this: Joe Biden's administration is absolutely unified with the Trump administration as far as their foreign policy posture. There's basically no daylight between the two regimes as far as the Trump and the Joe Biden. They basically taken the exact same stances. In fact, some of Joe's have gone even further in the militarization or hawkishness nature of those stances. So yeah, Joe Biden being just like Trump on foreign policy has basically been par for the course so far.
100%. I mean, definitely financially. In his first military budget, he raised the budget. He's doing it again now. I think in total it's something like $30 billion additional dollars per year over the course of those two raises.
Didn't even ask for, yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, we ended a war in the meantime. I didn't realize that not fighting wars was so damn expensive. I guess I should have been taught that in elementary school, Waz.
Yeah, I mean, listen, man, Halliburton ain't gonna Halliburton by itself, okay? Lockheed Martin, they gotta keep the lights on somehow, and the way to do that is via the military budget, which is basically a welfare program for those type of companies.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's good to see some representatives standing up, against this. But a lot of representatives they love getting that money coming in, reallocating it might not. It's a frustrating situation, an ongoing war of our own.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.